Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide. Today we're discussing Southampton, arguably the largest port city in England and a city with a history that has seen its appearance completely transformed over the centuries. Indeed, such has been the transformation of Southampton that you have to work quite hard to get a true sense of its history when you visit. But never fear, that's what we're here for. That's what we will try to do in this episode. My name is Liam McGrath, and it's my pleasure to introduce my co-host, historian Daniel Gooch. Daniel, how many times have you been to Southampton, and what has brought you there?
I've been 7 times because I've seen Ipswich play there 6 times and England play there once. I feel for lots of people because Southampton is so out of the way. It's a bit like East Anglia. You don't go through it. You go there essentially for football or to visit the place, or you go to catch a boat. That's one of the big themes of this episode.
Absolutely.
Possible,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I don't suppose, you've travelled to New York or Cape Town via Southampton. Is that anything you've ever tried?
Not via Southampton. I've been to New York via a very different route, via plane. Much quicker these days.
No, well, that's the answer I expected. But at one time, Southampton was handling 46% of ocean-going traffic from England. It was the Heathrow airport of its day. 560,000 passengers in 1938. Now, last year, Heathrow catered for 66 million passengers. But at the time, that was how you travelled around the world. Well, in this podcast, we will first make a brief historical overview of Southampton before looking at its history from 4 perspectives, covering politics, industry, culture and urbanism, before giving our own view on how Southampton is as a place to visit compared with our expectations. Well then, Daniel, let's make a start with a bit of an overview. For those who don't know, where in the UK is Southampton?
Certainly. So Southampton is on the south coast of England. It's just over the water from the Isle of Wight, sits next to the English Channel, ideally located for sailing across to the continent, which we'll come back to later as an important theme in its history. It sits by the River Itchen. It's the largest of Hampshire, its county's 3 cities, and it's one of the 20 largest cities by population in the whole country. If you've ever visited the city, as I said before, it may well have been in order to board a cruise ship, as it's been the launching point for many of these for many years. Most famously, the Titanic, which set sail from Southampton in 1912. The first settlement of any note in the area of Southampton was the small Roman town of Clausentum, which was founded in 43 AD, just on the other side of the river from the current city centre, which itself is based on the old medieval centre, which was founded later. The Anglo-Saxon settlement of Hampton, no south yet, followed later. It was established as a burh, or a Saxon defensive militarised city. The first record of this Saxon settlement of Hampton dates from 919 AD, and it became a very important port, as did the later medieval settlement of Southampton, which exported wool and other goods, imported many goods, notably wine from the Royal Angevin kingdoms in France. Now, one question many people wonder, which we might as well cover at this point, is why is it called Southampton, especially when it's nowhere near really Northampton? It is. And, well, the leading theory is that it does date from this period, the Saxon period, which was when Southampton was in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex. Northampton was in Mercia, and once Mercia was absorbed into Wessex, to distinguish between the two within the same kingdom, those 2 prefixes were added to distinguish Northampton, which is further north, and Southampton, which is further south. Now, Southampton, as it was then, became one of England's most important ports in the Middle Ages as well, both for imports and exports, and it continued to form this important link for the Angevin kings with their lands in France. Many of Southampton's most notable buildings, including the substantial city walls, which remaining a large part today, date from this period. After a later economic decline, the construction of a railway link with London caused the port to rise again in prominence in the 19th century as a centre both for freight, for goods, and for passenger liners. And today it remains one of the country's most important ports, one of its largest ports, and one of the major embarkation points for cruise ships. The city centre itself retains quite a lot of its original medieval buildings, but a great deal of it in the centre was rebuilt after damage during the Blitz in the Second World War. And one point we'll be assessing later is just how well all those different parts, all those different eras of construction in Southampton fit together.
So it sounds like the town moved slightly across the river between Roman, Saxon and medieval periods. Not far, but it sort of moved its centre of emphasis, if you like.
That's right. So the original Roman town was on the other side of the River Itchen from the current town centre. It was quite small. There isn't a direct link between Clausentum and Southampton today, aside from the fact they're in the same area. The Saxon town was founded later on the west bank of the River Itchen, but in a different location from the Roman town and the later medieval wall town, in the area of Six Dials, getting towards the football ground. But the medieval wall town was founded really where the current city centre is, much more in that location. So this moving around means we've got to be a little bit careful about our definitions, because technically they're separate places, but the histories are all quite intertwined. And given that the modern expanded city of Southampton easily encompasses all these areas, I think for our purposes, we're happy to, for historical purposes, treat them all as part of Southampton today.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great overview. So let's get into our first category, politics and war.
Right, we're going to start this category with a very famous name, King Canute, a name who will be familiar to many of you. Canute was a Viking, king of Denmark and Norway, who was also the king of Anglo-Saxon England from 1016 to 1035. To give it a bit more context for the city of Southampton in this era, Southampton was never a great political centre for the Anglo-Saxons. It was overshadowed in this sense by the capital of Wessex, Winchester, which was further north in Hampshire. But Southampton was more important, less politically, more as a trading port, which we'll look more at later. But there are a couple of interesting links with Canute. First, that Canute was elected king in Southampton by the Anglo-Saxon Witan, which was the name from the Anglo-Saxon Council in Southampton in 1016. There was a rival Witan in London, which led to some disputes over the throne later, but Canute did eventually gain control of the whole kingdom. And if you think of Canute, you probably think first of the legendary story of his attempts to stop the tide coming in, something we probably all learnt at school or read about in our childhood. It was either done as evidence of his hubris or to prove to his sycophantic advisors the limits of royal power in the face of God, depending which version of the story you've heard. I think the latter is generally accepted as the correct one in speech marks, if it ever happened. It's been suggested this event may have happened or been imagined to have happened in Southampton, but it's generally thought more likely that it was set in Westminster, but Southampton has some claim to be the location. And just adding to the apocrypha around Canute in Southampton, there is a ruined building called Canute's Palace in Southampton. It is actually, though, a Norman house from much later, so not really connected with him. But there's also a Canute Road, there's a Canute Hotel, so the town at least does try to project a connection with him.
Yeah, there is this Canute connection embedded in the streets and buildings, and similarly we have connections to the Mayflower. There's a Mayflower Park on the waterfront, there's a Mayflower Theatre. What's the connection with the Mayflower?
The connection there, I suppose the context is Southampton, always an important departure point for passenger ships, always been an important embarkation point for emigrants leaving Britain. And the most famous examples are the Titanic, which we'll look at later, and the Mayflower, which famously carried emigrants from England to form the first permanent colony in New England in America in 1620. There isn't too much more to say on this point, really, other than that it reflects Southampton's important role in emigration from Britain, but it is commemorated in a few buildings in Southampton. You have the Mayflower Theatre, which got its new name after a renovation in the late 80s, and Mayflower Hall at the university. So it's celebrated in the town as well.
There's quite a few towns in England that claim association with the Mayflower: Harwich, Leigh-on-Sea, Plymouth in Devon, Dartmouth. But I suppose Southampton has the claim of being where the Dutch pilgrims changed ship. Great. Okay, so to what extent Southampton played a part in military history?
There's never been anything like a major one-off Battle of Southampton, but seeing it's an important coastal city, an important coastal port, it has had its share of military action over the years. If we go back over a millennium, the Danes attacked and sacked the Saxon town several times in the 9th and 10th century. They were unfortunately unrepelled by the Danegeld payments, which were made to try and ward them off. But later, Southampton was probably most notably attacked pretty brutally and burned down by a combined French, Genoese and Spanish force in 1338. That was part of a broader naval campaign, which incorporated raids by French naval forces, among other private pirate raids, on the English coast during the early part of the Hundred Years' War from 1338 to 1339. The war had really started in 1337, just a year before this. The raid on Southampton was the most significant raid on any English coastal town of this period by those French-commanded forces. And as a result of the raid, the citizens of Southampton fled away and basically the whole town was destroyed. One notable consequence of the attack came from the fact that it exposed really how unfit for purpose Southampton's town walls were. They offered no defence against sea attack. There was no proper wall built on the coastline. So as a consequence, shoreline defences were built, and these walls survive now as what's known as the Arcades. This area of the town walls originally consisted of merchants' houses, which opened directly to the waterfront, but you can actually notice today that the arched openings were blocked up later in the 14th century to form a solid wall. You can see exactly where they've been filled in those archways. As well as these, what you might call defensive actions, Southampton has held an active role in English military history. It's been a set-off point for many important military expeditions by English and British forces. Later on in the Hundred Years' War, Edward III set off for the battles of Crécy and Poitiers from Southampton, while Henry V set off for Agincourt from Southampton in 1415. In fact, due to the fact that Henry V was planning to depart from Southampton, it became the location of a plot known as, imaginatively, the Southampton plot to depose him in 1415. The plot was concocted by several noblemen who planned to replace him with Edmund Mortimer, who was a great-great-grandson of Edward III and the heir to Richard II. There's a bit of a convoluted story there, but Henry V's father, Henry IV, had deposed Richard, so Edmund Mortimer, that subject of the plot, arguably had a better claim to the throne than the king himself. But it was actually Edmund Mortimer himself who grasped the plotters up, told on them to the king, and the ringleaders were arrested and tried in Southampton. It's been suggested the trial took place on the site of the Red Lion pub in the city centre, which is very old, as you find out when you go into it, though the current building dates from just a little bit later. There's no contemporary evidence for that being the location of the trial, though. Though what isn't in much doubt is that the plot leaders were executed in front of the Bar Gate, which was the main gateway to the city, which still stands today. Now, the plot itself was immortalised by Shakespeare. It appears in Act 2 of Henry V, although Shakespeare shows it, I don't think without any real basis, as financed by the French as an attempt to stop Henry travelling to France. It's really been understood as kind of a characterising plot designed to show the development and the maturity of Henry V into the wise and ruthless leader who covers the plot and executes the ringleaders. This is in contrast to his immature character in the earlier Shakespeare plays, the Henry IV plays in which he appeared. Now, although the plot was unsuccessful, interesting to do a little bit of alternative history there and think what might have happened had it not been successful. Could have been no Agincourt, at least not as we know it. The entire future of the Wars of the Roses could have been very different if Mortimer's line, which led directly to his nephew Richard, the Duke of York, could have been the reigning family much earlier.
There was this strong royal connection. Henry II was a regular visitor and he stored his wine collection in Southampton Castle.
Well, it was a very important import point, an export point for the royal family. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it had that link between England and the royal lands overseas, because up until roughly that point, kind of the end of the Middle Ages, certainly in Norman and Angevin times, the English kings were as rich in French lands for much of the time as they were in English lands. They weren't just kings of England, they were kings of a huge empire, really. And even later on, when much of the empire fell, there was still that claim to be king of France. There were still battles with France. There was still trade going on with France. And being located where it was, Southampton was a very important place to be controlling.
Well, absolutely. And that importance as a debarkation point, if you like, went on throughout its history, and it was reprised. I mean, particularly in the 20th century, 1914, World War One, much of the British expeditionary force came from Southampton, from what was known as Military Embarkation Point 1. Troops would be stationed in Southampton Common, not far, probably about a mile out the city centre. It's estimated 7.1 million men passed through the port, as well as 800,000 horses, 5,000 tonnes of munitions, 5,000 tonnes of munitions per day. And again, in World War II, the city was again the key port for troops to leave the country, including for the D-Day landings. 3.5 million troops passed through the docks. So Southampton became this giant designated military area in the Second World War. And all the while, the city was producing munitions and, of course, had a critical part to play in the development of the Spitfire. The prototype Spitfire flew from Southampton Airport in 1936, and the Supermarine factory at Woolston went on to be a key supplier of Spitfires. This is celebrated in the Solent Sky Museum near the Ocean Village, and indeed not far from Canute Road that you mentioned earlier. To this day, there's still a military presence around Southampton, across the River Test. The Marshwood Military Port is the base of Royal Fleet Auxiliary, so a key part of the logistical elements of the British Navy and Army. So a major point in military history throughout the ages. Okay, then I think we ought to go on to scoring in the politics and war category.
As we said, there's been no one single major battle that's taken place here, but we can certainly point to those consistent military skirmishes and plots which were even notable enough for Shakespeare to write about. Plus, we do have some of the physical remnants of this remaining in the city walls and the ruins of the castle, which we'll talk about later. On the politics side, there's less to say, but I can't fail to be impressed by the fact that arguably the two most famous passenger ships in Western history set off from here. And I'll give it extra points because the excellent Sea City Museum, which you mentioned earlier, does a very good job of covering not just the story of the Titanic, not just the story of military embarkation for Southampton, but also the general story of emigration and development of the city around the docks and the port. So just in the celebration alone, I think it gets good points. So I'm going to give Southampton a 6.5.
Yeah, there was far more about political and military history than I knew when it came to Southampton. I thought it was really interesting with King Canute, the Kings of England, and its role in military in the important history of English naval history over the centuries. So for me, it's going to be a 6.
Yeah, I suppose it's maybe that lack of a major battle. There is no Battle of Southampton, which takes you away from thinking of it as being really celebrated in British military history. Something like that does help, a major single event being attached to it. But yeah, good scores. So that's 6 for Liam, 6.5 from me. It's a reminder on this podcast, we start from 5 and work upwards or downwards. So both positive scores, 12.5 out of 20 for politics and war.
Our next category is science and industry. In the overview, Daniel talked about the location of Southampton on Southampton Water, which is the body of water between the rivers Itchen and Test, where they come together and go out to an area of water called the Solent, which is the part between the Isle of Wight and Great Britain. Now, the Solent has a peculiar tidal pattern. As a result of the way the tides resonate in the English Channel, the Solent has a double high tide of 17 hours. Now, you just need to look this up on the internet. I honestly can't explain it. It's very complicated. But the point is, it's an extra long opportunity for ships requiring deep waters to be handled in the port at Southampton. This has given great advantage to the port, And as such, the port dominates the city centre today. It's almost unique in that way as a British city. So let's talk about the history of the port of Southampton.
Yeah, let's do that. I think we should probably talk about what we mean by a port town here, or a port city, because I know in the introduction you said Southampton is one of the largest port cities in the country. So we should explain exactly what we mean by that. The Cambridge Urban History of Britain talks about Southampton as a true port town in the sense that it's always been a town that has been centred genuinely around its port and really couldn't exist in the way that it does without it. This is opposed to other cities or towns. Some of them may be bigger, but they happen to have a port there, but they weren't necessarily entirely centred so closely or intertwined so closely with their port. So they weren't, in this definition, true dependent port towns. Southampton sits next to the River Itchen. It has the English Channel to one side of it, to its south coast. It has historically been a trading port. That's to say, its main function historically was to administer and process trading goods from often elsewhere, notably wool and wine, rather than being a centre of some specific industry that just happened to rely on the port. It's been theorised that the reason for Southampton's importance as a port is less to do with its Saxon trading past, but more to do with those Angevin alliances and territories held by Henry I and other Norman and Angevin kings in France. Southampton was that main link to the territories in France to transport wares between there and England. But also inland, the town had good trading links with Winchester, the former Saxon capital, situated in the same county, in that post-conquest era, post-Norman conquest era. The port underwent a decline in the 15th century, partly because of a drop-off in Mediterranean ships stopping here, but also because quite a lot of trade started to become more concentrated on London, which really happened because so much of Southampton's trade came into the hands of London merchants, London capitalists who moved their trade to London. There was later a further decline in the 18th century. Daniel Defoe described it at that time as, in a manner dying with age, the decay of the trade is the real decay of the town. This decline seems to be reflected in what I found as a surprising lack of other historical travel writing about Southampton. It may mean that in the early modern period there was little reason to visit the city. It could also equally mean that due to its isolated position on the coast, people didn't generally travel through there as much as they did later when they had good reason to, say, board a ship as a passenger there. But we do know that Southampton underwent a resurgence in the 19th century when new railway links helped the city build on this history as a trading centre and allow it to keep up with modern maritime technologies. The first dock in Southampton opened in the 1840s, just after the opening of the London and South Western Railway to Southampton, which allows Southampton to act not just as a hub for goods, but also as a major passenger hub and branch out into being a hub not just for movement of goods, but one for movement of people. It became the fifth largest port in the country within just 20 years of the railway opening. Later, rising level of imports between the First and the Second World Wars helped Southampton's port to thrive. And today it's the second largest container port in the UK, behind Felixstowe, and the second largest passenger terminal by number of passengers, behind only Dover.
So it really dominates the city, and it's worth just reflecting on how that port area, that dock area, sits around the city. So I probably need a map for this, but starting in the east on the River Itchen, what is today Ocean Village, which is a modern development, a marina with flats and shops. At that point was where the international ships would dock. And then going west from there is a succession of docks, some of which are still in use today. In fact, many of which are still in use today and protrude into Southampton water. You've got the Empress Dock, which today hosts the National Oceanography Centre. Further around west are the White Star Dock, famous for the Titanic, and the modern cruise terminals and smaller ferry services which go across to the Isle of Wight from the town quay, which is well worth walking along. And further west still, we have the Mayflower Park, which is a park with a good view across the River Test. So again, worth a look. Great views of the massive container ships that you see coming in to the huge area of reclaimed land to the west of there, absolutely huge, covered by the modern docks. It's actually hard to appreciate how much of the land there has been reclaimed, but the water used to cover over all of that container dock area, as far north really as by Southampton Central Railway Station. So that's nearly a kilometre going out of reclaimed land. And this has totally altered the way the medieval centre of Southampton appears to be situated within the urban context. So rather than being a peninsula, medieval centre would have almost been a peninsula in effect. It doesn't feel like that anymore because of this reclaimed land. And it's a really good idea. If you're interested in this, it's really interesting to look at the historic maps of Southampton to get this idea, how the docks have grown around the medieval centre. And in fact, there's a fantastic interactive map showing this at the Sea City Museum, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that large map in the first room you go into is excellent. It's showing that exactly how much land has been reclaimed, how the shoreline has changed, but also how the centre has moved about over history as well. What we talked about, the Roman to the Saxon to the medieval to the modern period, you can see it all changing in a kind of big rendering in front of you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. But then I love maps. Historic maps, always a winner for me. Now, I mentioned the White Star Dock, and this is the huge dock. It opened in one of the huge docks. It opened in 1911 to accommodate the massive ships of the White Star Line, the Olympic, the Britannic, and of course, the Titanic.
Yeah, perhaps the most famous historical event linked with Southampton and the central theme of an important exhibit at the city's main museum at Sea City, the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, which set sail from Southampton and left a deep legacy within the city. Southampton was, as we mentioned, a major embarkation point for passenger ships leaving Britain, and one of the main reasons was its proximity to London. But another reason was its proximity to Europe. It meant that ships could easily cross the channel to reach the city and drop off or pick up passengers. And this continued well into the industrial age. And the deep water dock at Southampton, which, as you mentioned, was specifically constructed in 1911, was built specifically so that large ships could sail there, built in 1911, just 1 year before Titanic sailed. Liners were hugely important to Southampton's economy, not just directly in the employment opportunities it offered people on board the ships, but in other secondary sectors that ranges from the obvious service industries like hotels and restaurants for boarding passengers to, as an example, uniform production for workers on board that took place within Southampton. On the Titanic itself, I don't think we need to give a detailed account of what happened, as most people, well, everyone really will know the basic outline of the story. But what we can talk about is the direct impact on Southampton, which was immense, primarily because the ship picked up a huge proportion of its crew from there. 80% of the ship's crew signed on in Southampton, while 40% of the crew were natives of the city. Part of the reason that there were so many local people eager to work on the ship was that there was a coal miners' strike earlier that year that had disrupted sailing, so there had been a bit less work to go around at that point. But the human side of this is that many of these men had families in Southampton. Because passenger ships provided such a regular source of work and income, there was no separate sailor town that you might have seen in other port towns, and the crew that were on board and that died were really ingratiated into the community. It means that the sinking, in which most of the crew were lost, was not just a source of news, but it was a phenomenal human tragedy for Southampton. 549 of the people who died in the sinking, more than a third of the total, were living in Southampton. It's been described as the day Southampton went silent, and one person living there at the time said he didn't know of any streets where at least one of the residents hadn't died. After the sinking happened, it took some days for the full details of the event to get to Southampton, but in the meantime there seemed to have been lots of rumours running rife around the town. One local described the panic he remembered in the town when people heard about the sinking. He said he described people literally running around the streets, women running instantly out of their homes, still in the middle of the housework wearing their aprons, descending in panic on the White Star office to try and find out what had happened. what the office did was put names up on the gates of anyone who'd been saved, and people were going down every day to see if their, in most cases, husbands, brothers or fathers had been rescued. You can look on Google now, you can actually see photos of the crowds of people gathered round at the office reading these lists. Given how many people died, the impact on families in the city was colossal. One headmistress of a local school wrote in the school log, "A great many girls are absent this afternoon. Fathers and brothers are on the vessel, and some of the little ones have been in tears all afternoon." And the sinking had long-lasting repercussions beyond just that immediate tragedy. It affected even the demography of the town, along with the First World War afterwards. A woman who grew up in the aftermath of both said, "When we were growing up, there weren't a lot of young married men about. There were very few." Another woman whose father died at the age of 23 said, "It was just natural for quite a lot of people not to have a father." Today, Southampton still commemorates the local lives lost in a memorial to the engineers who died on the Titanic. And the Sea City Museum, which opened in 2012, exactly 100 years to the day after Titanic set sail, I think does a very good job of telling the story, not just the sinking itself, but also how it affected the city.
Absolutely. It's a really good exhibition in there. I don't want to give it away, but it's quite impressive how they've incorporated that exhibition into the building, and also the angles they've gone for. So they've spoken a bit about the people quite a bit. There's a part about how the people of Southampton were affected, like you've spoken about, and there's also a part about the inquiry into the sinking afterwards, which I thought was really interesting, and it also has some fun stuff as well. Like
it was. I think it has a bit of everything. I mean, it has the fun bit where you can pretend to drive the ship. That was nice, but it also gives that distinct local slant to the tragedy, telling you the story of what happened in Southampton with first-hand accounts towards the end, really looking at the lives of the people who were left behind as well as those who survived and those who died. And I think that makes it a really unique and distinctive look at this famous event.
And there's also the church with the commemoration as well, which is quite impressive thing to visit. Well worth walking to. It's in Southampton city centre.
Holyrood Church, the one destroyed during the Blitz. Now,
the cruise liner company Cunard, they moved to Southampton, and they are a descendant of kind of White Star, and still headquartered in the city. They're headquartered at Carnival House, and Union Castle liner ships between Southampton and Africa went on for some time, and they named all their ships Castle: Edinburgh Castle, Dover Castle. And Union Castle House is still there. And there's a Titanic trail which goes around the city, has a few interesting stops at those memorials and other places. I stopped for a drink at a pub on the trail where some staff, some lads did so much drinking that they actually missed boarding the vessel. Now, the industrial history of Southampton, and that's mostly evident through the docks. But it's a large town, and it's got a large university, the largest in the southeast region. So what role has Southampton played in scientific discovery?
There's not much to say here. One of the most famous possible events, it's not really scientific discovery, but I'll cover it briefly anyway, is it's been suggested the Black Death may have entered England through Southampton. This suggestion comes from a 14th century chronicler called Henry Knighton, but it's far from certain. Other points of location, such as Bristol, have also been suggested, but it's a known claim within the city, and not surprising for such an important port. Talking about scientific discovery, the University of Southampton is the largest university in the southeast. It's perhaps no surprise that it has the National Oceanography Centre. Perhaps the most notable academic figure at the university is Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web. But it's fair to point out that he worked there. He's been working there after coming up with his main innovation. So it's not like the World Wide Web was invented at Southampton University. Other things to mention, though, the headquarters of the Ordnance Survey were moved to Southampton in 1841 when there was a fire in the Tower of London, the previous headquarters, and it still has offices there today. Finally, going to modern times, Chris Packham, the famous naturalist, he was educated to degree level in Southampton, and he still lives nearby. But that's probably about all there is to say on the scientific side. There's less there than on the industrial side.
Well, I'll give you one more innovation in Southampton, if you like. Big area of interest for me and many people. Southampton has a large geothermal energy heat network right in the city centre, right under your feet. In 1987, a well was drilled down to 1,800 metres depth and extracts water very hot, 76 degrees. And this provides energy for a few buildings around the city centre, including the West Quay Shopping Centre, Solent University.
So was this a particular innovation come up within Southampton, or was it just a testing ground?
I believe it was a testing ground, an exemplar project. Well, look, that was a fascinating round.
Very interesting.
A lot to say there. So for my score in this area, I think it's a positive score again. A lot of industrial history around the docks, some fantastic museums that celebrate it, such as the Sea City. We've got all the history of Titanic and the ability to really feel absorbed in the history of the Titanic through walking around the city. So for me, it's a 6.
What I think is there's not really been any one single world-changing, unique, major industrial or scientific innovation that's come from Southampton. No major world first or major idea that has changed the world. But on the positive side, what I like is it's got itself a real sense of identity and a bit of uniqueness through those maritime connections. And I'll also give the city credit again for how these are celebrated in the Sea City Museum. It's not just a museum of local history. It's a museum that says this is our identity. We are a sea city, and it does that very, very well. It covers the sinking of the Titanic, its impact on Southampton, and the city's role in migration to bring all those points together. It's not a massive museum, but it's one of which the city can be really proud. Definitely my top recommendation for something to see when you're there. So my feelings are also marginally positive on this as well. So I'm going to give it a 6 as well.
That's a good score.
So that's 12 out of 20. Again, positive. 5 is your starting point for science and industry.
Pretty good. Well, our next category is arts and culture. And look, I wouldn't say Southampton is known as a big hitting city for arts history, cultural history, but we will always find stuff on this podcast. Historically, there's no trace of it now, but due to the ferruginous waters around the Bargate in Southampton, it was something of a spa resort. Going back to the 18th century, the Prince of Wales came to visit in 1750 to bathe and to sail, and for all intents and purposes, it was a pretty trendy, a bit like a Brighton kind of town. But there's not any trace of that left now. There's a Spa Road. But what we do have as a major cultural event today that people flock to is the boat show.
The Southampton International Boat Show has been held since 1968, and it's the largest boat show in the UK. It claims to attract a 6-figure attendance each year who presumably spend an awful lot of money on some very expensive hobbies covering all sorts of marine activities, boating and other water sports as well. It was actually on, if you recall, when we went there, and you could really see just how big it was. They fence off a massive area of the coast and running inland more areas running inland to host it. It reflects that it's one of the most important cultural events that's happening in Southampton. Moving away from maritime connections for a bit, a very famous name in the entertainment world, Benny Hill, the very famous TV star, actor and entertainer, was born, raised and went to school in Southampton, then buried there when he died. He became inspired to perform by watching variety performers in Southampton, and he first got involved in performing via a music and dance group in nearby Eastleigh, where Southampton Airport, as it's known now, is, where he worked as a young man. Benny Hill isn't shown much at all on TV now. I think there's a very obscure heritage channel on satellite which still shows some of his stuff now and again, because admittedly a lot of his stuff would come across as rather dated today, but his TV programmes were incredibly popular, not just in the UK, but around the world. I know they were popular in the USA. I was listening to a podcast recently where an American was talking about how he used to watch Benny Hill regularly on TV when he was growing up. So it's He had worldwide fame at one point. He also had a Christmas #1 with a song about a milkman. I think it was Ernie, the fastest milkman in the West, which you might know. He acted in several films. He was in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. So even if his comedy output was of its time and isn't seen quite so much these days, he did transcend this in several important ways.
Very well known. And of course, that very famous piece of music, which we all know and love. You will know it if you think you don't know it. Do just search Benny Hill theme.
There aren't many major musical connections, but one that we should mention quickly is it's had some role in the development of UK garage. The Artful Dodger from Southampton, as is their most famous collaborator, Craig David. I think one of the members of the Artful Dodger, Mark Hill, studied at the University of Southampton and met Craig David there.
For the uninitiated, this is a type of electronic dance music characterised by irregular two-step rhythms. So not just that persistent 4 beats that you might get in many genres of dance music like house or trance. Garage is a breakbeat genre, more irregular shuffled rhythm, and was very popular in the late 90s. And Artful Dodger were one of the biggest in the genre. Artful Dodger did a track called Rewind, and that propelled Craig David to great fame. Craig David's been a big deal. He's been nominated for 14 Brit Awards, twice for Grammys. Again, you've probably recognised some of their tunes. Moving Too Fast, Crowd Say Bo Selector.
Yeah, he's had a resurgence recently, hasn't he? Okay. Kind of moving on to summing up now.
Let's move on to summing up.
Yeah, we've not said very much in this category. We mentioned the university a bit, but to be honest, it's pretty striking just how few really world-changingly influential people have come from a Russell Group university, particularly in artistic fields. So it's not going to be a great score. But I'll say I do have a personal soft spot for Benny Hill. I used to spend many, many hours, and I do mean many hours as a young child, watching my dad's Best of Benny Hill VHS on Saturday mornings, probably at a younger age than I was really supposed to. So he's definitely someone I'm familiar with, someone I used to watch a lot, even if it's just the same hour and a half of material every weekend. So it's not going to be a no score, but it's still going to be a fairly low one. I think it's going to be a 2 from me.
No, not a great score from me either, as much as I enjoy listening to a bit of UK Garage today. And I like the Benny Hill theme. For me, it's a 2. It is quite a low score, but it had other categories.
Yeah, I mean, what I talked about before, it having its identity, it's very clear its identity comes from really its industry rather than its art or its culture. So I think the scores reflect that fairly well. So yeah. Okay, if we're both happy with the 2, that's 4 out of 20 overall for art and culture.
Category is urban landscape. So let's talk a bit about how this town centre has moved and evolved over the ages. Let's start there.
So the Roman town, as we mentioned earlier, was called Clausentum in the general area of Southampton today. It was on the other side of the River Itchen from the current city. It was fairly small. It had gravelled streets laid out in a grid pattern and fortified with a ditch, a rampart and later stone walls. There isn't, as I said, this direct continuation of habitation between Clausentum and Southampton, really, other than just the general geography of the areas. So for the city's real genesis, I think we have to move on from here to the Saxon period. Now, the Saxon trading town, the port town of Hamwick, was founded around the beginning of the 8th century, possibly by King Iron of Wessex. It was situated on the west bank of the River Itchen, which was in a different location from the Roman town on the opposite bank and from the late medieval wall town, which was to the east. It was in the area of 6 Dials, getting towards the football club's current stadium. In fact, when the stadium was being constructed about 25 years ago, archaeological digs did find a Saxon cemetery, and you can see some of the findings from that in the Sea City Museum. On Hamwick specifically, it was the largest town in England in the 8th century. It was also the first planned town in post-Roman Europe, so it has some historical importance. It had its own mint installed by King Athelstan, and it was laid out like the Roman town in a grid pattern, covered an area of about 110 acres, excavations have so far uncovered over 65 structures in the town. The city's main export at this time was wool. One of its main imports was wine. In another familiar story, the town went into a bit of a decline after the 10th century, which may have been caused by the River Itchen silting up. And so as a consequence, a new, smaller settlement was founded called Hampton, which is where our story enters the Middle Ages.
So there's association between history of Southampton as a wick and Ipswich, our hometown.
Yep.
And I think you spoke about this in the Origins episode. Both Ipswich and Southampton were key towns along with London.
Yeah, so I think they were both very prominent port towns at the same time. I think Southampton, Ipswich and London were really the three major port towns. Ipswich's claim to be the oldest English town, I think, comes from the fact that it's been continuously settled in the same area and has the same street pattern. So Ipswich is potentially the older there from that perspective.
Well, then let's move on to the Middle Ages, where we start to see some of the shape of the city that we see today.
We've already charted the general history of medieval Southampton as a port town, but one thing we'll cover here is the remnants of that period, because Southampton does have quite a lot left from the Middle Ages. And the most obvious example is the city walls. I won't cover them in really extensive detail here because we looked at them in detail in our special episode on walled cities, but I will recycle the same quote I had then from Nicholas Pevsner, the very famous architectural historian, who said, "In all of Britain there are few, if any, examples of medieval urban defences as impressive as those in Southampton." The first defences were simple banks of earth with gateways added in 1200, but the first stone walls started to be built later in the 13th century, with the circuit around the city fully completed by 1290, completed with the notable exception of the gap facing the coast, which, as we saw earlier, was filled in the 14th century after the brutal raids during the early part of the 100 Years' War. Today, most of the east and south parts of the wall have gone, but a lot of the other two sides remain. Bargate, one of the original walled entrances to the city, is definitely the highlight. It's one of the most detailed gatehouse constructions in the country and something that every visitor to Southampton will want to see. The only part that might disappoint you is its surroundings, especially the fact that the walls immediately connecting to the gate were both knocked down by what you might politely call planners, other would call vandals, trying to build roads through the city. But unfortunately, it stands there disconnected from the walls these days, thanks to that.
It's not an ideal setting, is it? And that bit of an example of what it is an example of what you see across the city in many ways. But the walls do help us get a sense of what the city looked like historically, what its shape was before the massive changes brought about by the port and, of course, the destruction during the Second World War, the Blitz. And the walls encircle an oblong, roughly 2 kilometres long, and within this space, by and large, is a medieval urban fabric. But it does at least give you some sense of it.
Yeah, there are some remnants, as you say, of the medieval castle butting right up against the walls. The first wooden castle in Southampton was built probably in the 11th century. The first recorded mention is in 1153. It was rebuilt in stone in the 12th century when Southampton had become an important trading town. Its function was less military, more as a warehouse for royal imports. The hall was even turned into a vault for wine storage in the 13th century. Inasmuch as it did have a military purpose, it was quite unlike many other castles we've looked at because it was more important for coastal defence against seaborne attack rather than for use in domestic land warfare like civil wars like the Anarchy. The castle was rebuilt by Richard II in the 14th century and had cannon added in 1382. It was actually the first castle in England to have these because of the threat of French attack. The castle later became a rubbish dump in the 16th century. It wasn't very well cared for. It was sold off into private hands and it didn't see any action at all in the Civil War, which is unusual for a standing castle at that time. It was later mostly demolished and most of the motte, the hill on which the main defensive building of the castle stood, was flattened in the 19th century. In 1962, a rather incongruent, I'd describe it. A block of kind of modernist flats was built on the remaining motte, and those flats remain today. But you can still see bits of a tower, the hall, and the vault. And while there isn't a great deal left, it's all still recognisably part of a castle.
Oh, absolutely. And if you go immediately south of the castle, there are more remnants of historic buildings on the west side of the walls. We have the Tudor House and Garden, King John's Palace, the Arches of Colour, all great historic buildings worth seeing. And on the south side, the Wool House, which is now a microbrewery. We had a beer in there. The God's House Tower, which you can go inside, and Southampton Bowling Green, the oldest bowling green in existence.
We have to get sport in somehow, don't we?
Oh, well, we'll come back to sport, I'm sure. And near to the bowling green, we've got the Town Quay, where you can take a boat to the Isle of Wight by foot, or Hythe. The Hythe ferry is very nice, by the way. And the Town Quay, if you head north from there, you're through the heart, really, of that medieval centre, going up High Street, leading up to the Bargate, which you spoke about. This street was a major pinch point in Southampton for many years. In fact, trams used to run along it, and trams used to run through the middle of the Bargate. Hard to believe now. And those trams had to be built to the specific dimensions of the Bargate. Eventually, in the 1930s, the buildings adjacent to the Bargate were pulled down, and it feeling so isolated in the middle of the road. To the north of this medieval core is a collection of large city centre parks, which are a huge asset to Southampton, in my view. And they were laid out in the late 1850s and early 1860s. They're known as the Southampton Central Parks. And they're called West Park, East Park, Palmerston Park, Hounswell, Hoglands and Queen's Park. And they provide a chain of 21 hectares through the city centre. And the East Park is where you find the Titanic Engineers Memorial and Cenotaph, first of dozens of First World War cenotaphs designed by Edwin Lutyens. You'll find them all over the country. That was the first. And near to there, adjacent to there, is the Southampton Civic Centre, which is a collection of 1920s and 30s classical-style municipal buildings. These include the Guildhall, the City Council, and what's now the Sea City Museum. In my opinion, this is one of the best civic centre districts in England architecturally. It reminds me a bit of Cathays Park in Cardiff, especially when viewed from Watts Park to the north. It's nowhere near as big as Cathays Park, but it's impressive. I think this is a wonderful collection of 20th century buildings just to the north of that medieval centre. But I think that was something of a high point architecturally for Southampton, because the next decade was the 1940s, and we all know what happened then. Massive changes in the urban landscape of many British cities after the Blitz. And we discussed in our first episode, going back to Coventry, we discussed the devastation destroyed Coventry city centre, and Southampton, like Coventry, was a major target because of its busy dock and because of manufacturing Spitfires. There was a particularly severe daylight raid on the 6th of November 1940, and that targeted the Civic Centre. 12 bombs were dropped, including a hit on the art gallery, which killed 35 people. And overall, there were 57 air attacks. And you mentioned earlier the Blitz hit the Holyrood Church, which is now a memorial to the Merchant Navy seafarers. But much like what we spoke about in Coventry and Hull, which was bombed severely, it was the post-war planning which has been so divisive. There was already a plan for the Southampton city centre to make it easier for cars to use, but the impetus was even greater after the war, and the development plan of 1952 saw large changes to the city centre. Bargate and above Bar saw construction of new commercial buildings, some of which were attractive, and we can certainly see parallels of what we've got in Coventry and Hull and Exeter. Major reconstruction. But I think more damaging to the city centre today was the large areas of road which really dominate around the civic centre and northern parts of the city centre. Similarly, there are some post-war buildings which just don't fit in the medieval core. I'm thinking high-rise flats like Castle House might have seemed modern at the time, but seem somewhat incongruous today. To the immediate east of the medieval core is a redeveloped area I mentioned earlier, Ocean Village, and this is the old passenger docks which have been converted into modern flats and restaurants. And I think this again is a bit of a mixed bag. I think there's it's great to have elements of the waterfront opened out, but actually the views of the River Itchen are somewhat blocked off by some of the development in the 90s. I think there could have been a better job of bringing the river into the city. To the northwest of the medieval core, that's on the other side, near to the Central Railway Station, it's an area of big box retail parks and the massive West Quay shopping centre. Again, this is the big box retail offers a poor quality route really between the city centre and the station. I think it's been a bit of a missed opportunity for the city, and I know there's a long-term development plan to change that. So thinking of the urban fabric, I think the urban fabric in many places, particularly what's happened in the second half of the 20th century, is quite poor, but we're starting to see improvements. I thought some of the infill development happening in the city centre was good quality. It's a very modern city centre. I think if you look at the average age of the buildings in the city centre, it's very young compared to a lot of city centres in Britain, and I suppose it's quite representative in many ways of some of the major 20th century urban phenomena in Britain. So the coming and going of industry, the Blitz, subsequent post-war car-dominated development, suburban sprawl, that's all very much on display in Southampton. Going back full circle to the original Saxon town, you and I have been several times to the football ground at St Mary's, and this part of the city is slated for redevelopment to try and open it out onto the River Itchen. And St Mary's, well, it's just incidentally, just to finish off, what's the background to the football team being there?
Oh, well, they do have origins, that part of the city. They were founded, I think it was in 1885. They're originally called St Mary's Young Men's Association. They were founded by members of the St Mary's Church Young Men's Association. They changed the name afterwards, so I think just St Mary's FC. Then I think it was 1894 when they became known as Southampton FC. They moved out later to the Dell, which was further away in the city, I think just to the north, closer to the station, slightly more central, but moved back to the new stadium called St Mary's in that area about 25 years ago.
I remember. Well, that area is slated for redevelopment to try and open it out to the river. And St Mary's Church is very nice, but the area around the football ground is still largely sort of light industry and low intensity development. But that's potentially an option for the city to grow towards the river, and it's Saxon's starting point. So there you go. I think that's the end of our category on urban landscape. What's your feeling on the scores?
On the walls, one of the major attractions, I'll repeat my conclusion from our special episode and just say that in the amount of preservation, the walls are fantastic. They do fall a bit short of the really great walled cities of England, even despite how much has been preserved, because they don't seem to surround the current core of the city in such a complete and delineated way. They surround the medieval centre, but it's not like, say, York, where you feel you are entering a brand new separate place when you pass through the gates or over the walls. On the rest of the town, on the rest of the city, I should say, it's the same story, really. There is so much from the past that survived, but it sits behind stuff that, to my mind, is not particularly complimentary. It doesn't feel like a historic city in the round, more a city with historical patches to it. So to me, it's a reasonable score because there are those bits to see, but it's going to fall short of being the top scores. So it's going to be a 4 from me.
Okay. I mean, I think it's a similar score for me. I think there are so many buildings of wonderful potential in Southampton and so many interesting buildings. I talked about Canute Road, which has got the buildings by the Station Union, Castle House, really, really cool buildings, but kind of just let down by the setting. Nicer buildings around Bedford Square to the north of the city, but too much of it feels a little bit disjointed, and not enough access to the waterfront is a frustrating point for me because it's such an important feature of the city. I wish there was more. I wish there's the Mayflower Park, but it's okay, but a bit more would be great. So for me, urban landscape is going to be a 4. Great, and that brings us on to our final summing up, which is we call reality versus expectations. What did you feel about the city when you visited compared to what you expected? Or
what do you know about Southampton before you go? It's got a very high population. It's about 250,000 people live there or in the area. It's known for having maritime connections, maybe not in the historic sense. That it's perhaps not thought of as a great historic city of England. So your expectations are kind of middle of the road there, I think. It, as we said, has lots of remnants of its past. It doesn't do much in the overall urban experience. In other categories like art and culture and science and industry, there's nothing world-changing, but it does at least have that identity as the sea city. And that brings me on to my main positive, the one thing I enjoyed most and that I expected least, that museum, the Sea City Museum. I've been to plenty of local history museums. This is definitely one of the better ones. The way that it takes that one core part of the city's identity, amplifies it, and tells a story that you can really identify with, I think is excellent. So overall, I'd say it was just in line with expectations, to be honest. So I'm going to give it a middle of the road 5 out of 10.
As I alluded to at the beginning of the episode, for me, my perception of the place has changed. I have always struggled a bit with its urban landscape, trying to appreciate the historical buildings. But having done the research for this podcast, having been around it and really tried to understand it, I've found a lot that I liked. Loads of interesting buildings, loads of interesting history when you dig beneath it. Walk around the city walls, walk through those big parks through the centre. Go to some of the nicer fine-grained architecture of the north of the city centre. There's some wonderful streets within the medieval core and just to the east as well. Oxford Street, walking towards the terminal station, towards Ocean Village. There's lots of nice areas to explore, lots of interesting buildings. It's just a bit difficult to understand the context. So what I would say, if you're an urbanist, you love your urban history, your city history, learn a bit about it before, get an idea of what you want to see, get your head around the place. I think it's one of those cities that's appreciated more if you've got a sense of what you're looking for. I'd also say get out onto the river if you've got time. It's well worth visiting Southampton. It's well worth visiting the museums, but the city needs to do more to present itself. I know that's hard. It's a working dock city, port city. It's difficult. It's busy. But for me, it punches below its weight. It's a big city, so for me it's a 4.
4, okay, so that's 9 out of 20. So overall, politics and war was positive 12.5 out of 20. Science and industry was 12 out of 20. Arts and culture, the lowest scoring, 4 out of 20. Urban landscape, 8 out of 20. Reality versus expectations, 9 out of 20. So it's 45.5 out of 100. As we always say, you don't have to score well in everything. Having one or two things that you're scoring well in is probably more important to giving you an identity and really a reason to visit. So yeah, I definitely got a lot out of Southampton, enjoyed my visit there.
That's all we've got time for today. We're going to keep up the theme of the South Coast soon. We've got an episode of Brighton coming up. We've also got an episode of Peterborough coming soon. Where else have we got coming up?
We're planning a first, what we think is probably going to be our first 2-parter. We're going to be looking at Liverpool. We haven't done anywhere quite on that scale yet. And I think there's going to be so much to say about Liverpool. That's probably going to be one we split into a couple of episodes. But yeah, going to be a great place to go.
Thank you for listening. If you've got any comments on this episode or previous episodes, please get in touch. You can visit our website at yeoldieguide.com. You can tweet us at yeoldieguide. Say hi. We've got about 20 episodes online at all the podcast directories covering cities we have visited and some special episodes about the origins of cities, city walls.
Thanks a lot for listening. See you next time.